There's a video everyone makes about the first $1,000. There's another one about the first $10,000. And they're both fine. They talk about discipline, budgeting, cutting subscriptions, making your coffee at home. You've heard it. My name is Jimmy, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, investing, and the psychology behind how people use it. If you're someone who wants to understand money a little better, consider subscribing and giving this video a thumbs up. But nobody talks honestly about what happens after $20,000, and I think the reason is that it's genuinely harder to explain, because it's not about habits anymore. It's not about motivation. Something structurally different is happening to your financial life, and if you don't understand what it is and why, you'll hit $20,000 and keep treating your money like you had $2,000. That mistake costs people years. So let's talk about it clearly. When you had $500 in a savings account, the interest was a joke. Literally. At 4% APY, that's $20 a year. You could spend more than that on a bad lunch. When you had $5,000, it was $200. Still noise. Still easy to ignore. At $20,000, that's $800 a year in a high-yield savings account alone. Without doing anything. Without waking up early, without a side hustle, without a single extra hour of work. That's roughly $67 a month appearing from nothing. That doesn't sound like a lot. But here's why it matters. It's the first time in your financial life that your money is doing something noticeable without your direct involvement. You now have a very small, very weak employee working for you. And that employee will never call in sick, will never ask for a raise, and will keep compounding silently in the background while you sleep. The number is small. The principle it reveals is enormous. Now move that $20,000 into an index fund and hold it for 20 years at a historical average return of around 10%. That's not $20,000 anymore. That's closer to $134,000. You didn't add a single dollar after the initial deposit. The money did that. And this is the part most people hear, nod at, and completely fail to internalize. Because when you have $500, compounding is a theory you read about. When you have $20,000, compounding is a fact you can watch happen to your own account. That shift from abstract to real changes how you make every financial decision going forward. Here's the second thing that changes, and this one is less talked about. Your relationship with risk stops being emotional and starts being strategic. When you had very little money, risk felt binary. You either played it safe or you gambled. There was no middle ground because there was no buffer. One bad bet and you're back to zero. That's not a psychological weakness. That's That's an accurate read of your situation. You were right to be scared. But at $20,000, you have, for the first time, real optionality. You can split your money. You can keep 6 months of expenses in something stable and still have capital left over to put to work in higher risk, higher reward positions. You're not choosing between safety and growth anymore. You can have both, in different proportions, at the same time. That's not a luxury. That's a structural change in what's available to you. Most people don't take advantage of this because they keep thinking the way they did when they had nothing. They keep the entire $20,000 in a savings account because it feels safe, not realizing that at their age, over a 20 or 30-year horizon, inflation is actually eroding that money in real terms every single year. The same fear that protected them at $500 is now quietly working against them at $20,000. The strategy that got you here is not the strategy that gets you further. Now let's talk about something nobody wants to say directly. At $20,000, your income starts to matter less than your decisions. Not your income in absolute terms. More money is always better. But your income as the only variable that controls your financial trajectory. Below a certain threshold, the only lever you have is how much you earn. But once you have capital, how you deploy that capital starts to compete with your salary as a driver of your net worth growth. Think about it this way. If you have $20,000 invested and it grows 10% this year, that's $2,000. You made $2,000 doing nothing. If you earn an extra $2,000 through overtime or a side hustle, you've had to trade time, energy, and attention for the same outcome, your money produced passively. As your invested assets grow, this comparison keeps shifting. At $200,000, a 10% return is $20,000. At that point, your portfolio is competing directly with your annual salary. At $500,000, for many people, the portfolio wins. This is why people who understand money obsess over their savings rate and investment decisions more than their salary, especially early on. They're not being naive about income. They're being strategic about what actually compounds over time. The third major shift is how $20,000 changes your psychology around work, and this is the one that catches people completely off guard. When you have no savings, you need your job. Psychologically, that need colors everything. You're less likely to push back on a bad manager. You're less likely to leave a dead-end role. You're less likely to negotiate because the cost of the negotiation going badly, losing the offer, losing the job, feels catastrophic. You're negotiating from desperation even when you don't realize it. $20,000 is not enough to retire on. It's not even close. But it is enough to survive for 4 to 6 months without income, depending on where you live and how you spend. And that changes the energy you bring to every professional interaction. You start making decisions based on what's actually good for your career rather than what's immediately safe. You negotiate differently. You set boundaries differently. You evaluate opportunities differently. Not because you've become a different person, but because the financial reality underneath you has actually changed. This is what people mean when they talk about FU money, except they usually mean millions. The truth is there are smaller, incremental versions of that feeling. $20,000 is one of them. It doesn't make you fearless, but it removes a specific kind of fear, the fear of immediate ruin, and that alone restructures how you move through your professional life. There's also something important to say about what $20,000 reveals about your spending. Below that number, spending feels like survival. Every dollar you spend is a dollar you didn't save, and that trade-off feels raw and immediate. But a lot of people hit $20,000 and quietly start lifestyle creeping because the urgency fades. They've made it. They've crossed the threshold. They deserve to enjoy it. And that instinct makes complete sense emotionally. But the math is brutal. If you save $20,000 and then stop, or slow down significantly, you've captured almost none of the compounding benefit. Compounding is not about the lump sum. It's about the lump sum plus consistent additions over time. Someone who saves $20,000 and keeps adding $500 a month for 20 years ends up in a wildly different place than someone who saves $20,000 and coasts. The first person ends up with roughly $500,000 or more. The second person ends up with $134,000. Same starting point, completely different destination. The only variable is whether they kept going. This is why the discipline that got you to $20,000 isn't something you cash in when you arrive. It's the thing you have to preserve even as the urgency that created it fades. And that is genuinely hard, because urgency is a powerful motivator and you've just removed most of yours. The last thing I want to address is something that most finance content conveniently skips. $20,000 is not equally achievable for everyone, and pretending otherwise does real damage. If you're earning minimum wage in an expensive city, supporting a family, dealing with medical debt, or starting from a negative net worth, the path to $20,000 is not just a matter of cutting lattes. It requires either a significantly higher income, a dramatically lower cost of living, or both. The principles in this video apply regardless of where you are on that journey, but the timeline varies enormously based on factors that are not always within your control. What is within your control is understanding what you're building toward and why each threshold matters. Because the person who understands what $20,000 unlocks is more motivated to get there. And more importantly, more equipped to actually use it correctly once they do. So if you're at $5,000 right now, you're not far away. If you're at $10,000, you're closer than you think. And if you've already crossed $20,000 and you're keeping it all in a checking account because it feels safe, I want you to sit with that for a moment. You've done the hard part. The habits are there. The discipline is there. The question now is whether you're going to put that money to work or let it sit still while inflation quietly erodes it. There's one more dimension to this that almost nobody in personal finance talks about, and it's the social one. Money doesn't exist in a vacuum. You have people around you, friends, family, coworkers. And once you've accumulated something real, those relationships start to surface pressures you didn't have before. Some of it is explicit. Someone close to you needs a loan. A friend wants you to split a vacation you can technically afford, but that doesn't fit your plan. A family member finds out you've been saving aggressively and suddenly has opinions about what you should be doing with your money. These conversations are uncomfortable, and a lot of people handle them badly, either by giving in and derailing their own progress, or by becoming secretive and cold about money in a way that damages relationships. The better approach is to decide in advance where your boundaries are before the request arrives. Not because people around you are bad, but because in the moment, with emotion and relationship stakes involved, your judgment will be compromised. Know ahead of time whether you lend money to family, under what conditions, and what your limit is. Know whether you're willing to stretch your budget for social experiences and which ones are worth it. These aren't financial decisions. They're personal decisions that happen to have financial consequences. And $20,000 is usually the point where you first have to make them seriously. There's also a quieter social pressure that's harder to name. When you've been disciplined long enough to save $20,000, you've almost certainly been living differently than people around you. Maybe you've been driving the same car for years while friends upgraded. Maybe you've been skipping trips, cooking at home, wearing the same clothes. And at some point, that gap between how you're living and what you could technically afford starts to feel strange. You have the money now. Why aren't you spending it? This is where a lot of people silently capitulate to lifestyle inflation. Not because they made a conscious decision to spend more, but because the psychological justification for not spending becomes harder to maintain once the money exists. The discipline was easier when there was nothing to spend. Now there's something, and every day you don't spend it feels like a choice you have to actively remake. Understanding this pressure doesn't make it go away, but naming it means you can make the choice deliberately rather than drifting into it. There's a real difference between deciding to upgrade your lifestyle because it aligns with your values and your plan, and upgrading it because the friction of not doing so became too uncomfortable. One is a decision. The other is a slow erosion. The people who build serious wealth over time are not the ones who never want to spend. They're the ones who get specific about what spending actually matters to them and ruthless about everything else. At $20,000, for the first time, you have enough that this distinction becomes real. You can't optimize everything, but you can decide what you actually want and protect that and let the rest go. The money you have right now is not the finish line. It's the starting gun for a completely different game. And that game has different rules, different strategies, and different risks than the one you've been playing. Make sure you know which game you're in.